Good afternoon, all, or good morning, depending on which corner of the globe you might be attending this webinar from. Welcome to the session that we're having today. It's on I think, a fascinating topic in regards to navigating regional expansion and mergers and acquisitions opportunities. So, I think this is a terrific topic to talk about, whether you're an owner looking to expand your business or potentially an owner looking to merge or sell your business. It's obviously an area that I think, has a lot of interest, whether you're looking at it from a sort of a bidder or a vendor perspective. I think the interesting thing is that there's actually a lot of activity happening in our space at the moment. I'd like to suggest that we're in a bit of a super cycle for sort of PR deals, and it's sort of the most that I've seen in well over 15 years in regards to the level of M&A activity which is happening globally. We're seeing strategics taking stakes, we're seeing private equity deals, we're seeing big shops merging, such as sort of the Finsbury and Sard Verbinnen deal. So I think it's very timely to have this discussion. So with no further ado, we'll do some introductions. I've got with me today Elizabeth Lewis-Jones. Liz founded an agency called Liquid. She's the founder and CEO, and she's managed to successfully build that agency across 23 jurisdictions. So it's fantastic that Liz has been able to join us today. And also Dan Pender, who's now a managing partner at Fin Partners in Ireland. And his experience is coming more through the vendor side of things, in that Dan sold his agency 360 into Fin Partners. So I think we've got, from Liz's perspective, we've got a very successful founder and CEO who has built her business both via organic and inorganic growth. And Dan Pender, in terms of the experience he's had building up his own agency and then selling it into Fin Partners. And then from my perspective, my name's Peter Brookes. I'm the founding partner of a firm called Citadel-MAGNUS, and we sold our business into a global shareholder proxy agency called Morrow Sodali, which is backed by TPG, the private equity firm, and we did that only very recently, back in November 2022. So I'll also be able to bring some insights to this presentation or webinar today in terms of some of the very recent experiences I've been through from a sale perspective. But on that note, I think it just might be worth handing over to Liz, just you first, for a little bit more of an introduction on your story.
Okay, thanks ever so much. It's a good morning because it's 6:30 in the morning here. So my brain and mouth are just still trying to coordinate. My story is quite simple. I set up Liquid 19 years ago in a room above my mother's garage. It was literally a garage with no heating, just painted the breeze blocks, magnolia, put in a couple of IKEA desks. I had a 3-year-old and a 5-month-old at the time because I stupidly thought it would give me work-life balance. And of course, I've never worked so hard in my life. As soon as my children started to grow and didn't need me quite as much, I then started to look at how I could expand the business. And it was 2010, the 2008 recession was really hitting in the UK. We also had a new coalition government in. I had done a lot of public sector work, and obviously that money was drying up. So I looked to go overseas, and I acquired a consultancy in the Channel Islands, so in Jersey and Guernsey, which gave us a really important point of difference. It enabled us to operate in the offshore financial sector, which nobody else within the UK was doing. We're the first UK consultancy to go over there. And I think actually that's quite important because when you do an acquisition, you need to have that point of difference. You need to understand why, what's the commercial reason for doing this. The business grew, and then a client gave us an opportunity to expand overseas. And this client is Maple from Canada. And they kind of said, can you do everything you're doing in the UK, but for us in Australia? And it's like, yeah, we can do that. So we actually put one of our UK superstars into Australia, and she set up the business over there with a lot of support from the UK office. But we're now starting to recruit locally. And I think that's really important. So we did that organically. And what we wanted to do was to make sure we had the same cultures and values, which is key to the growth of a business, especially on the other side of the world. And somebody who is absolutely bought into the process, where when I acquired a business, they didn't necessarily share the same kind of values and culture that we did. So hopefully that gives a brief overview of the two different routes I took in order to try and grow the business. And one of the reasons for going to Australia was not only because of servicing the whole APAC region, but also we were aware of the free trade agreement between the UK and Australia and felt that was a great business opportunity that we could really utilise.
Thanks, Liz. There's going to be plenty of areas we can come back and explore there in regards to some of the areas that I think the participants will be interested in. And then Dan, based in Dublin, you sold your business into Finn Partners. I know that Peter Finn has had incredible success building out effectively a global agency, which is very much being driven by his M&A strategy, which he's been undertaking for a number of years. So I'm really keen to just hear a little bit more in regards to how that came about and your experience with Agency 360.
Great. Thanks, Peter. And good morning, everyone. Delighted to virtually meet with you all. So if I start, I'll give a bit of a brief overshot. And as you said, Peter, we can dive as deep as you want as we go through it. So if you start at the present, I guess, today I'm the managing partner of 360, a Finn Partners company, to give us our official name, in Dublin, in Ireland. But I guess the journey to this point, Peter has alluded to, whereby on the 1st of December 2021, we were acquired in full by Finn Partners. We were a business who at that point was 10 years old. I had founded the business back in 2011. I had, I suppose, little more than, as I said to people before, a mobile phone and belief, deluded or otherwise, that I could do this, and a motivation, I guess, to want to establish an agency for myself. I had, strong views on the value that communications can bring, both commercially and strategically, to the businesses and organizations we work with. And I guess I had the advantage when I graduated from university. My first job was in a PR agency, a startup PR agency. I was employee number 2. I literally had to bring my own chair to work. So I was used to the experience of a startup culture. That was a very successful business, but it gave me a great insight into what commercial success was in a PR agency environment and what that required. So when I detoured from there I worked for a period of about 4.5 years in politics here in Ireland. I was an advisor in both a general election campaign here, and then subsequently went on to work in government. I then worked in, I think, the only so-called normal job I've ever had for a period of 14 months. But I always knew that the journey was bringing me back to agency world. And, the question was always whether do I go and join an agency, which were, there was options in that regard, or do I do it myself? And as I alluded to, I kind of had the view on what I always wanted to do something myself. I started out going on my own at the back end of 2008. Very similar to what Liz described there. Within a reasonably short space of time, the International Monetary Fund were running Ireland. Literally, our government had to hand over control of the running of the country to the IMF because of the crash. My mother thought I was crazy doing what I did, and lots of other people did too. And this is maybe something we could talk about. I think, if anything, I think the environment was actually quite opportune in that regard for a multitude of reasons. So I started to grow, made my first hire, made my second hire, got your second client, your third client, your fourth client, and just started to build and build. And then in 2011, we kind of restructured to set ourselves up for kind of a more aggressive go at it, rebranded and went further at it still. And then, by the end of 2021, when we sold, we were a team of, I think, over 20 people working with a range of different types of clients in a range of different type of areas. We're generally advised at kind of C-level and do a lot of campaigning type work. But the journey to get to that point, which I think is something we'll certainly talk about, Peter, as we go through. I always had a kind of view of where I kind of wanted to go, and was always doing things with that in mind. But lots of things along the way, I didn't know the answer to, and lots of things along the way I was dragging myself up off the floor and going again. So, lots of different parts on that journey up until literally Finn Partners came into our world.
Interesting. I mean, I think there's a very interesting common thread which I can add to as well in terms of Liz and Dan and my journey in terms of setting up Citadel-MAGNUS, in that the three of us have collectively done it when effectively the macro environment has been pretty terrible. And my story was that we set up Citadel. It was called Citadel at the time, not Citadel-MAGNUS, in 2008. And it was during the absolute blowtorch of the global financial crisis. Like, literally, Lehman Brothers had gone bust. The Dow Jones was plummeting 1,000 points a day. There were rumors every day around other major financial institutions going bust, and we decided to go and set up a comms agency. And I had a 1-year-old child, I had a 3-year-old child, had a massive mortgage, and my wife thought I was absolutely nuts going down that path. And it was quite interesting because, of course you're nervous when you go out and set up your business, but what actually emerged out of the financial crisis was what I would almost call a golden period for communication, because what came out of that was all sorts of things such as the Wall Street movement, Get Up, the whole rise of shareholder activism, company boards being under all sorts of pressure that they'd never experienced before, and where the protection of reputation and those sorts of things really came into their thinking for the first time. So it was actually, from Citadel's perspective, it ended up being an incredibly fantastic time to go and start a business, because, and I think this is the thing about being in the communications game, is that to a large extent, where there's a lot of volatility, where there's a lot of uncertainty, the need to communicate better and communicate more clearly really becomes more apparent. And I certainly saw that in the early days of Citadel. So sort of, rode that wave, and then just sort of kept on going with it, which was quite interesting. So, but then, I think just the other thing, just quickly, obviously I didn't say it at the beginning there, please submit any questions online, and we'll either come to them during the course of this webinar or at the end. But obviously the more interactive that we can have this, the better. So please jump online and ask any questions as they come along. I think one of the interesting things, Liz and Dan, is do you actually, it's that whole area and that question around, do you actually set up your business to effectively sell your business one day, or do you actually set up your business to stay independent? Excuse me.
That's a really good question.
And I think there's, I know personally, there's so many stories where people have sold their business and they have regrets about it for all sorts of reasons. And, there are so many people, and I know lots and lots of agency owners who would always prefer to stay independent for so many reasons. So I think it's actually just an interesting area to explore, because I think a lot of people just naturally think that, oh, if someone approached me and I was offered money for the business, then of course I would sell it. But I think a lot of people go through the process and actually come to the conclusion that, what, we prefer to stay independent. So maybe, Liz, it's worth throwing to you on that point, just in terms of your views. Obviously, you've stayed as an independent agency as opposed to going down that sale path, but it's something that I think, eventually all owners may have to deal with that question.
Absolutely. And at some point, I will have to retire. But I'm having too much fun at the moment. And, it's my third child. And I think, like any child, you want it to grow and to nurture and to make your business independent, so it can actually run without you needing to be in it. And I think that's really important. So at Liquid, what we've done is we've grown over the years. And some people, so our country lead for Australia joined us as a senior account exec. And she's grown over the years. We have this really strong senior leadership team. And I think that's really important, because nobody should be the risk to the business. But also when it does eventually come to a sale, and I'm hoping that my senior leadership team will end up buying me out. That'd be perfect, wouldn't it? They can make me chairman and I can go and sit in a rocking chair somewhere. That would be fantastic. But yes, I think for me at the moment, it's very much keep growing, keep developing, keep doing something just slightly different. And I'm just having too much fun. I think when you don't have that fun, that's when you need to start thinking about it. And also to think about how you would react to having a boss. I'm not very good at being told what to do, and I'm quite upfront by that. But I don't know how I would cope with it.
No, that's right. And Dan, we mentioned this last night. I mean, the whole process of getting comfortable with your, potential new owners, and the critical element, which is really the reverse due diligence that you need to know and do in regards to fin partners, or in regards to myself, it was really around Morrow Sodali and TPG. So what was your experience there, Dan?
Yeah, I mean, just to take those 2 points then in order, starting with the first point around, the merit or not of going down this route to begin with. I think there's probably a commercial consideration and a personal consideration in that regard. And I think the commercial consideration starts with, no business, as they say, can stand still, and you're in trouble if you stand still. Ireland, I was always very conscious of, Ireland is a relatively small economy. We tend to be very outward focused and externally focused, because we've had to be over the years. When you have a population of just over 5 million, there literally ain't enough people on the ground to make everything work. So, as an economy, we've always been quite outwardly focused, and a lot of growth that the successful Irish companies has been kind of built on that platform of external and international growth, and I was always very conscious of that. Equally, we've a lot of foreign direct investment into Ireland, in the financial services sector, in pharma and wider healthcare sector in particular, and a lot of the buyers of our services in that sector procure internationally. And it used to be a source of great frustration. And I sound lovely and relaxed saying that here this morning, but it used to be the source of great frustration to me when I used to see, as I used to refer to them as the factories, being the ones that were, getting certain mandates purely because the comfort level that came with a decision that was taken in a headquarters on West Coast America, or EMEA headquarters in London or somewhere, where it was easier. It's always easier to pick an international agency over a local one. So, we were finding ourselves competing for those mandates, coming second, told we were brilliant, but, your footprint is largely just Ireland. So, we had to confront those kind of things. And then I think the other kind of thing you think about in that regard from a personal perspective, and I'm not just talking about me personally, but also kind of our team personally, you have people who want to stretch themselves, want to better themselves. They're curious by nature, and they're interested in doing interesting work. So if they see opportunities to, do more internationally, that's something that people can be drawn to. And I was curious to that end, and I know a number of my colleagues were as well, because, and this is something I think, it just briefly jumping back when you talked at the outset, Peter, about that period when we set up, one of the other big things in that kind of 08 to say 2013 period was, it was a brilliant time to be recruiting people, because unfortunately a lot of people found themselves out of work, but more particularly you really got to see the diamonds emerge. There was a different quality of people that put their hand up at that time, which was really, really interesting. And then transitioning right through to then, your question about, are you giving up your independence and, what you go through? There's definitely an element of that. And I think, whilst we all hear the stories, I can only talk to my own experiences of it, of where, yes, when you have a suitor or potential suitors and you've got to weigh all the things up and you've got to reach a decision. Yes, first and foremost, it starts with, they're both doing due diligence on you and you're also doing it on them. So you're trying to get a sense of the culture of the place, the people behind it. I spent a lot of time largely virtually because it was during the pandemic, which, wasn't ideal, but I had met Peter Finn previous to that in 2019, at the back end of 2019. And I spent a lot of time getting to know him. He also, to his credit, spent a lot of time introducing me to a lot of his managing partners and senior people across the world. I got to know them. I got to speak to both people who had organically grown with Peter and the leaders of companies that he had acquired. So I had a good feel for that. And I had made it my business, I guess, as well over the period to be a bit of a student of the sector and try to get to know different types of companies as well. So you weigh all these things up. You're giving up certain things, but you can't have your cake and eat it, I guess. And ultimately, I found the primary thing that they buy you for, in my experience, they've left you to get on with that, and they haven't been overly interfering. Yes, there's little small things that you now have to do that you wouldn't bat an eyelid about before, and you'd make a decision like that. But I guess that's the different dynamic you enter into.
Yeah, and then that decision-making process around, do you go down a sale path or do you stay independent, becomes more complex, obviously, the more shareholders that you have in the business. So
that's a great point.
Obviously for yourself, Dan, you might have had, a majority control of the business or whatever it might be, but certainly from my perspective, I had a number of shareholders to deal with. So that adds a different level of complexity in terms of what everyone's aspirations are and career paths, and some of the shareholders may actually really hold those the value of being independent as being a critical thing for them going forward. So in terms of sort of corralling not just yourself but actually other shareholders through a process, if you decide to go down that path, can be a critical part of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And to that end, like, just for the benefit of giving people some insight in that regard, like, I was a 95% owner of our business. Crucially, and this is something I know we might come to later on in terms of when you talk about structure, etc., of your business, my fellow company director was a tax lawyer by profession, but he was much more than that. He was one of the most brilliant commercial strategic minds that I've ever come across, and was pivotal in so many ways to our business. But the fact that I was the majority and he was also on the same page as me from day one made things much more straightforward. I had a senior team as well, of 5 people who I had, vested in the business as well from a financial perspective, not from an ownership perspective, just from a kind of reward structure perspective, which was useful as well. I think it's, and again, something we might come to a little bit later on, managing your people through a sale process is not without its difficulties. But I think people were we had a team that were largely on the same page throughout the process, which made it a little bit more seamless. I think I can only begin to imagine what, Peter, you referred to there, in a structure where, the shareholdings or the ownership levels are much more disparate. And people have different motivations, people have different likes and dislikes, and that can be complex. And a sales process is stressful enough as it is. And that adds another layer of stress to it.
Yeah. Well, actually, I think it sort of segues into that next area, which is really just talking a little bit more about how you potentially prepare your business for a sale. Are you preparing your business for just being a sustainable business, a long-term growing sustainable business? Are you preparing it for a sale, or by default, are you actually doing both at the same time? Liz, how do you think about that in terms of that sort of preparation piece for a sale, in terms of what agency owners really need to be thinking about sort of from day one if they want to be going down that path?
Sure. And I think although we're not looking to sell, we always try and run the business as though we are. So even sort of, last year I got a consultant in, he specializes in M&A, to come and do an audit of the company and to make sure that actually all our processes were really robust. And we also have the PRCA, Communications Management Standard. And I think it's really important that you run the business like you're going to sell it. So if somebody comes in and does the due diligence, everything is there. I don't even sort of, take a bottle of milk and try and sort of put it through expenses we've got a demonstration kitchen in our Birmingham office. We run it so everything is absolutely, if someone wants to come in and audit it, it's done. And I think that's really important. And from day one, you need to have those processes in place. I also think that just looking at the questions that are coming up, when you do that, don't ever underestimate the amount of time it's going to take, just to make sure you've got all those processes absolutely spot on. And when you do go through any kind of merger and acquisition, the amount of data you have to provide people, and they set up, and I don't know whether this happened to you, Dan, but they set up a data room where you have to put everything in the data room, and you can't do like a data room dump. Everything has to be properly captured. And so you need to make sure that you've got all your contracts, that you've got all your supplier agreements. And that's just good running of a business anyway, so that if something was to happen, you can actually manage that really quickly.
Yeah, I think it's such a good point. I mean, basically, I totally agree with what you're saying, Liz. I mean, with Citadel-MAGNUS, we were setting that up as a sustainable business that could potentially outlive me. So, the idea that you've got a business there which might go on for decades. So how do you do that? What do you need to do to set that up? So obviously everything from having a really good shareholders agreement in place on day one, absolutely. Mission critical. Like you might do your shareholders agreement up front. You might look at it for 5 years, but then obviously if you're going through a potential sales agreement, to have a really well drafted shareholders agreement, number one, absolutely get it done. But obviously other things there, such as employment agreements, having your financials in really good shape, budget planning, forecasting, having a really good accountant on day one, mission critical. And then from Citadel-MAGNUS's perspective, another sort of key element of our growth was bringing in new equity partners. And I think this is a sort of a really interesting journey we went through, where at the end of the day, are you better off having a smaller piece of a big pie as opposed to a big piece of a small pie. And sort of we went down the path of going, you know what, we're going to have, again, a much more sustainable business. And as it was, a more attractive business from a sales perspective, to be able to turn around and go, we've got 6 equity partners across the business. We've got, you know, other managing directors, senior directors who are also on a path to get profit share, equity ownership, all those sorts of things. So actually, and these are things which, you know, take time to put in place, and you know, in regards to setting up that sort of sustainable business and the growth that you need, and also sort of the features that a potential acquirer are looking for. You know, I think they're all pretty important.
But I also say, you know, write your business plan and then shop it, because as soon as you've written it, it's kind of dead. And I think it's really important that you go with the flow, you go with opportunities. So, you know, I'm very open to say my business grew around my children. You know, when they hit a certain age, I went to the Channel Islands. Now they're hairy adults. You know, I've gone to the other side of the world. And I think that's really important as well. As a business owner, you have to do what's right for you, because everybody that you employ, you've got their salaries, their mortgages, their childcare, whatever, sitting on your shoulders. So you've got to make sure that everything works properly.
Yeah, no, that's good.
Just to add as well, then, I think these are really critical points that we've just touched on. And, you know, let's be honest about it. People in the comms world, we're not exactly renowned for our love of financial management and all matters administrative. So, but I've bad news, I'm afraid. We can't ignore it. Now,
Can't ignore it.
You know, if you're a founder or a senior leader in a business, you know, of course, you will have a realization, and that's a part that comes with the territory. But you know, we used to call it good hygiene in our business, and it was that you know, the basis of making sure that you had those fundamentals in place. Because then, you know, and Liz talked about the data room. When it comes to the point where you're actually populating that data room, you'll either have 2 experiences at that moment. One, you'll go, phew, that thing we did 6 years ago, 7 years ago, 8 years ago, thank God we did that, you know, at that time. Or you will see the benefits of it at that moment. And then you'll also have the flip experience. You'll go, oh my God, do we have a contract for such and such, or that employment contract we put in place, such and such didn't sign that, or can we find a copy of that? And you're chasing things up that you think never become important, and the smallest little things that you find come into play. Particularly, like I had an experience on one thing that came into play at the literally 5 minutes to midnight stage, which was so innocuous at one level, but it was a piece of housekeeping that literally was almost about to delay the deal by a quarter at least. That was relatively minor at one level. So these things become really important. And I think the other point that Liz makes, you know, which is very relevant, and I think it's, you know, looking back, particularly on the year 2021 for me, you know, you underestimate at your peril the impact the process has on your time, because, you know, you're, as the founder of the business and the leader in the business, no matter how well you run it and how well you know, bring others and other leaders into the business, all roads generally tend to lead back to you, even if you don't want that to be the case. So, and you know, particularly on the business development side of things. So for all of a sudden, then you've got this other thing going on, which quite simply could be one of the biggest things that's going to happen to you in your life. And it takes away, it eats into your time so much that it takes away from your ability to actually do the things that brought you to that point in the business. And the business is impacted by that. And you've got to try to keep your team on board. So that was, like, I found that was a particularly challenging thing for me in 2021. And it's, I really have to have your
again, I totally agree, Dan. We had a section we're going to talk about later on, which was hints and tips through any acquisition process. And my number one tip is you can't take your eye off your business if you're going through this process. And the DD process that we went through was quite extraordinary. Obviously, being acquired by private equity, and the thing that we very quickly came to the realization on was it doesn't matter if private equity are buying a business worth $10 billion or they're buying a business worth $1 million. They're going to put you through the same funnel of due diligence. So we went through this extraordinary process, which, I suppose there was two things about it. One was, even though it was exhausting and took up a huge amount of time, we look back on it and go, geez, we found out a lot about our business that we didn't know going through that due diligence process. Like the way that they're asking you to compile data on client segmentation and the productivity of employees and all those sorts of things. I mean, we just came out of this going, wow, look at this data we've found out about our own business that we didn't really know because we didn't track it that way previously. So that was a really interesting element to it. But secondly, as you said, Dan, it can be such a distraction. So what's the issue with obviously going through a transaction and that becoming a distraction? Well, the number one issue is that if you're going through a potential sales process and for whatever reason your numbers start to fall away, that's not good. So, you've got to obviously go through this sales process, but at the same time, you've got these forecasts in place. You've got to hit your numbers. You've got to go and find new business. You've got to look after clients. You've got to keep everyone happy. So, whereas normally you've got 8 balls in the air, I think when you're going through a sales process, you've got 28 balls in the air. And you can't drop any of them because it really is such a critical time for the business. So, that's my experience. It was the DD, and then really going, how do we do this where we keep number one, the eye on the business and running the business and keep the team happy and all those sorts of things. And effectively, we had one of our partners who, really took the ball and ran with it in regards to, the really owning that DD piece, which was incredibly helpful for us.
The last point I'll make on that as well, Peter, is I think, and this obviously depends on your structure and depends on the type of business you have, but I think that period, this is where having, whether it's a non-exec director or a strategic advisor to the business, I found absolutely critical because, it's a lonely place at the best of times. And when you're going through something like that, where, and this is the thing I struggled with as well, you have to be, how much information you can share with your colleagues and when becomes a real consideration. And it's something that you have to grapple with. So having, I would encourage, if you don't, to anyone joining this or viewing it, the value of having an external party involved in your business at a senior level that keeps you not just focused and honest, it's actually a really critical sounding board, and it becomes particularly critical during an experience like that.
Yeah.
I think it's also really important to think that, yes, this does take a lot of time out of a business, but we also have to think about the life cycle of a business. And predominantly, you start on sort of a growth, and every business goes through that upward growth, and then that will start to tail off. So actually, by expanding, by acquiring, by doing something different, you then have to invest to give that boost so you go back up again. And I think that's really important, that yes, it does take time out. And every time I've gone through this process, our figures have slightly dropped a bit, but I just see that as investment then into the business in order to start to motor up again. And the other thing I think that's quite important is a couple of years ago, and actually in lockdown, we have a lot of food clients. And so we have a chef director. And in lockdown, that became quite difficult, as you can imagine. We have a demonstration kitchen. We were doing lots of sort of, video and food photography. And I suddenly realized that actually he'd been an ops director for a very large 16.5 million chain of restaurants, never missing a side dish. And actually he then became our COO, and that has had a massive impact on the business. So I think in terms of growth, it's also really important to not be afraid to take people from outside our sector and to realize actually that the comms industry has a huge amount to learn from others, and to just think about the skill set, and again to have that point of difference. Because when you do any kind of merger, you've got to think, why am I doing this? What's the business reason for it? What will make us different to everybody else? Because essentially you just need a phone and a laptop, and hey presto, you can start wherever you are in the world.
Yeah, so you got a phone and a laptop. So at the end of the day, Liz, what are they, or a potential acquirer of your business, what are they acquiring? They're acquiring the people.
Absolutely. And clients, but people.
Yeah, and clients. But, I think the thing that we learned through this is they're acquiring, obviously, the senior partners of the people, but they were acquiring our whole team. So, what we needed to do was actually bring the whole team across and make sure that they were part of the story. They understood the growth opportunity. I mean, Dan, you touched on it, the opportunity of being part of a global business as opposed to just being a little business in Dublin or a little business in Sydney, what it would actually mean to be part of a global business. But for us, I think one of the biggest challenges was, it's fine to agree amongst the partners that you're going to go down this path, but then, you very quickly pivot and go, well, there's another whole team out there, maybe across multiple offices or jurisdictions, that you've got to get on board here. And some of them will like it and some of them won't. And that's just human nature. Some people embrace change, love the idea of, going forward as part of a new, bigger, shinier organisation. But then, there are certainly others who just go, wow, the idea of what we've got here and it changing, I've got a lot of questions about that. That isn't really for me. So I think that employee path and bringing them along on the journey, explaining it to them, all those sorts of things, that was probably one of the most critical elements that we went through personally, and we're still on that journey. Like, even though we're 9 months into the transaction in terms of our new owners, still that sort of integration piece and explaining it to the employees and how it's all working and the benefits and how 1 + 1 is going to equal 3 and all those sorts of things is still very much work in progress. But maybe Liz or Dan, do you just want to touch on the your broader experience with your teams in regards to M&A?
Yeah. Maybe if I go first on that, Liz, people say you should never get too close to your employees, and you should always keep a piece of distance for your employees. And yeah, I get that, but I rarely think it's as simple as that. And I think when you go through a process like this, that's particularly the case. Because I think, as you allude to, Peter, there's people who, let's say, came on the journey with you. Yeah. And lots of people, when I think to our team, they were attracted to working with us and working with me originally because of the journey. And it's the journey that stimulates them. And it's for a multitude of reasons, and that, the types of qualities that people like that bring, you can't put a price on, and really talented people. And then you come to that critical moment where, you're going through this process. You've got to try and strike a balance between, keeping people informed But then what level of depth do you go to on that? Because you don't want to distract people from the day job. You've also got a scenario whereby, this may or may not work out. And you don't want to get people into a space where something may be happening, then it doesn't happen, and then you've got to manage that. So you've got to get your timing right on, when you tell people and what it is that you tell them. And then absolutely, when it happens, reassuring people, particularly in that early stage. I saw very clearly in the first quarter in particular, like I remember we all gathered, and that the whole COVID thing was a kind of a dynamic in the mix of all of this as well, because we had moved to remote working largely at that point, but we were starting to come back together as a team, and meeting together in those early days of December, going into January, February, March. And a lot of people are looking at you as the leader and as the person who sold, going, what's he going to do next? And people have this kind of belief sometimes in their mind that, is he suddenly going to disappear? Is he suddenly going to be gone here? Is this going to happen to us? And, but they're all very understandable concerns. And I think if you can reassure people yourself, but you also, they get to know your acquirers. So, Finn spent time with us, getting to know people. And there's a reassurance that comes with that. But then equally, you'll find, and my last point on this is, and I spoke earlier about people on the journey. People also, when you reach that stage of the journey, we spoke about this ourselves. I regularly kind of use the analogy of like you're a train reaching different stations along the journey, and people will, for a variety of really good reasons, want to get off the train. So I can think of, two of our senior leaders have only this year left the business since we were acquired. One has gone on to become a managing director of a video conferencing business. One has gone on to be a director of public affairs in a big state utility in Ireland. It was the right thing for them to do. They, took the judgment call that was the right thing for them to do. And, I was sorry to see them go, but I couldn't disagree with them. And the reason I'm mentioning that is because, you will find as the founder and the leader, that will also happen. And that can be, a bit of a chore and a bit of an experience, but that's just all part of that evolution of the business that it tends to go through. So it's, you will go through the full gambit of emotions on all of that.
What are your thoughts, Liz? I mean, you've been through huge expansion. How do you think about that in terms of how it impacts on team and bringing them along on the whole path of what you're trying to achieve?
So obviously I've got two very different experiences, one sort of the acquisition and then the other organic growth. With the acquisition, I thought it was really important to try and make sure that, again, the company I was acquiring were aligned to us in terms of culture and values and were part of the process. So much so that we even did some joint projects first before we went down that route. But actually, I still struggled with it because they were in the Channel Islands. I took over a company which had directors. They didn't really, a bit like me, didn't really want to have a boss. I knew that I would fly over, they would say something to me, and then as soon as I was back on that plane, it would revert to how things were going before. So it was always quite a painful relationship. And in fact, last year I took the opportunity, because lockdown had taught me that we could handle a lot of the work out of our Birmingham office, to actually close our offices in Jersey and Guernsey. And again, I think that, it would have been a vanity exercise to keep them going. Because it's always lovely to say, oh yes, well, I've got all these offices. But actually a business reason was, we didn't need to have that cost anymore. So I think it's really important that to try and make sure that everyone is on that journey. With our progress into Australia, we've actually got people who've been in the business a long time. They absolutely have our culture and our values. They know what it stands for. We've worked with the team. We've made sure that we learnt from our mistakes before. And I think sometimes mistakes are a good thing, and we shouldn't be afraid to make mistakes and to put a hand up and go, do you know, I got that wrong. I'm going to do that again. And people I think, respect and they welcome that and they understand that. And they also then help you to solve that problem. And I think that whole transparency is key. So moving forward, every sort of 6 months, we sit down, I do a state of the nation. These are our finances. This is how things are going. Our COO is really strong on this too, just so that everyone has complete understanding of the business. And we find then that the team's on board and they're working with you. And I think that's been a crucial element of our growth too.
And Liz, given your, I suppose your mixed experience in terms of undertaking M&A yourself, can you see yourself going down that path of acquiring a business again, or are you much more of the ilk of, I'm going to just keep on building this business by finding really good people and plonking them in different countries all around the world and expanding that way?
Do you know, I never say never. I think it all depends on the opportunity that comes your way. So I often think, you know, why do you expand? Why do you go into a different country? Is it because of the skill set? Is it because there's a financial advantage to it? Is it because it opens up a new market? Is it because you've got, you know, for Australia, we had a client who wanted to be there, so it gave us that opportunity. And you know, that is the absolute ideal way. But actually acquiring does give you, as long as you've got a different point of difference, and we still do a lot of business in the Channel Islands, and we still have all that knowledge of offshore financial services within the team. So it hasn't been a complete disaster at all. And, you know, for 12 years, we had our offices in Jersey and Guernsey. So I think, it just depends what comes up. Never say never.
No, that's good. It's a great attitude to have. And Dan, so I'll throw you back to the day after Peter Finn's bought your business. You've been acquired. Day one, you've got you're under the thumb of Finn Partners and new ownership structures and targets to hit and earnouts and all these sorts of things which you have to go through. Just worth touching on sort of what are some of those challenges which you experienced early on under Finn Partners?
And you're trying to do that after, and you're exhausted as well at the time. I think look, and you know, without possibly going in depth on it, but your metrics that you've got to meet are there, and they're part of the structure of any deal. And no two deals are the same. There's different ways in which businesses are acquired. And you know, whether it's earnout models or you know, percentage level up front, and all the structures around those can vary. But ultimately, yes, there are targets and metrics that you have to meet. I would be, you know, yes, of course, they become a new dynamic in your life. But actually, when you calmly step back from that, it's ultimately what you were always doing anyway.
Yeah.
Just probably didn't view it through that prism, I think, which is something that you kind of need to check yourself on and check your team on, because I think, you know, otherwise you run the risk of, you know, becoming like that on the hamster wheel type, that you're living quarter to quarter, which I think is never a great mindset to be in. And I think, you know, again, I found the Finn model actually very positive in that regard, with a good degree of flexibility within it as well. And I think if you know, calmly evaluate it and back yourself and know and have the knowledge of, you know, well, you know, you wouldn't have got to this point anyway if you weren't good at the core fundamentals of, you know, driving a business and maintaining good revenues. So continue to apply that basic skill, even though, yes, you have a chief financial officer in New York suddenly, who's a new part of your world. And that is a whole new experience that you have to deal with. But it's, you know, so far we found it so good.
And then I think it also depends on whether or not you're being acquired, and they've effectively left you to, run your own business, and you're still, there running in your own office with your own team, or whether or not you're down the path we've gone down, where effectively our whole business has been integrated within Morrow Sodali Australia. So, we were sitting in a nice little office space in Sydney, had a team of 26 people, and now we're part of an integrated office with over 100 people in it.
Yeah.
So that's a big piece to go through in regards to culture, in regards to just the whole integration piece. And that's, I'd like to say it's a really interesting path to go down, but it's also a really difficult path. And again, I think a lot of it comes down to people and employees and teams and culture, and the culture that you had. They want that to be the same culture where they are now. And, I think this all comes down to going into any M&A situation with your eyes absolutely wide open, in terms of really, really understanding what it's going to look like when you're on the other side of the curtain.
Yeah.
And then I think we might be reaching our time limit. We've got one question which is unanswered, which has come up, which is really, what's the path to sale? Informal conversations leading to more formal, leading to preparation, leading to DD, leading to negotiations. I think from my perspective, Liz and Dan, it was a long path. It was well over it was a solid 12-month period, which incorporated all those things in terms of those informal chats, which then become more formal chats, which then lead into expressions of interest through to DD, and then everything that leads to it. But for us, there was a long path there that took, I'd like to say, sort of a solid 9-month period.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the rest. Yeah, I'm always amazed how long everything takes, especially if you're setting anything up organically on the other side of the world. You try and open an Australian bank account when you're not a resident there. You try and get your Australian business identification number when you don't have an Australian phone number,
Yeah, and all those things have just become more and more difficult, haven't they?
Oh, yes, absolutely. You've just got to be resilient.
Yeah. And I think I was just to add to it as well, I think that's a great question from Patrick, because it does take time. I think the path, there's a pathway before the pathway that Patrick even referred to when the informal conversation starts, as in, are you putting yourself in the line of sight or in a network where you're going to meet prospective buyers?
Yeah.
And I think, again, this is the great challenge when you're running a business like we do all here. How can you continue to also keep an eye on what's going on in the globe in your sector, and be what I used to call it, a student of the sector, and building a network within the sector where there are other leaders and other entities, whether it's even, there's plenty of private equity type buyers and all that out there as well, but and plenty of advisors in various parts of the world specializing in the sector. I think you've got to make the effort and energies to actually build up that network. I think doing so as well makes you much more informed. And it also links back to a lot of the questions we discussed earlier about, whether it's the right thing for you to do or not. You will become much more knowledgeable through doing that. But you will also build up people, a network. People always tell that story of, out of the blue, I got a call. Yes, but is anything ever out of the blue? They knew you to call you. And yes, your work and your trajectory is central to it. And, it's a small world. People get to know about you pretty quickly. But equally, you've got to make that happen. It doesn't just happen by itself. You've got to make it happen.
Yeah, I totally agree. The final question came in, which we've we've largely touched on, which was sort of how valuable a third-party M&A advisor is across a transaction. Certainly from my perspective, we used one and found the person we used incredibly helpful in regards to obviously the negotiation side of things, but also being a sounding board, and also helping corral other shareholders. So, we were in a position where having that sort of external third-party advice from a financial perspective, but obviously also a legal perspective, was critical.
Make sure they don't charge you half of your earnings. Yeah. All
right. I know we've just run over time, so I think we better wrap up. So, Liz and Dan, it's been great to meet you. It's been great to talk to you on the
Likewise,
other side of the world. Fascinating to share stories and war stories, and hopefully for all the participants that have been on, it's been a valuable exercise as well.
Absolutely. Delighted to partake.
Thank
you so much for your time. And thanks everyone for attending. We really appreciate it.
Cheers. Great to meet everyone. Thank you.
And you.
Thank you.